Gosh. Welcome, John. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome again to everyone. Thank you for being here. The way we'll proceed this evening is I'm going to share a presentation for, I was asked maybe somewhere around 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have breakout room time and then some broader discussion as a full group. And so, yeah, limiting our crises to talk about is a challenge given the nature of the world that we live in. So the way I'm going to proceed is actually first setting a context and talking about a couple of the crises that Pope Francis has spent the most time talking about, which are issues of economic inequality and issues of climate change. And that'll just kind of set the context for our discussion. Then we'll move from there into a very brief history of Catholic social teaching and just highlighting sort of the key principles of Catholic social teaching. Then at the end, just brief mention of a few additional crises. So we'll talk a bit about Catholic social teaching in relation to racism, issues of immigration, some of the things Pope Francis has said about current political movements, particularly those fostering division and scapegoating of people of other races and immigrants and such, and a little bit about Catholic social teaching in relation to COVID. And then we'll open it up for our small group conversations and then a broader conversation at the end. So I do have a PowerPoint, and I will hold that up here. Okay, so everyone should be seeing a slide that says Catholic social teaching and the crises of our time. Yes. Okay. There we go. And so one central crisis, of course, to be aware of is just the realities of economic inequality in our world. And so I thought we'd just start by looking at some information in relation to that. And there's a number of ways we can look at this, but this is some figures on poverty in the world today. So it's estimated that nearly 2 billion people, so about 1.9 billion people, or about a quarter of the world's population, live in serious poverty on under the equivalent of about $3.20 a day, so under about $1,200 a year. If we broaden out our focus a little bit to people living on under $2,000 a year, we get about half the world's population. So just under half of the world's population, so about 3.4 billion people who are living on less than $2,000 a year. And nearly 1 billion people who experience chronic hunger. You'll see varying figures depending on exactly how this is being measured, but you'll see figures from around 800 million to 1.2 billion or so, but a rough average is somewhere around 1 billion people. And important to say, of course, that's in a world that produces far more than enough food for everyone to be fed, right? And we can talk more about where all that extra food goes. A lot of it is fed to livestock, for example, but the world clearly has the capability to feed everyone and to feed everyone well, but doesn't. So there's these the deep issues of justice at the heart of that. If we look at figures on inequality, some of them hopefully are quite shocking. You may or may not have seen this figure before, but it's estimated that the richest 26 people in the world have as much net wealth as the poorest 3.8 billion people combined. So 26 people have as much wealth as half the world's population combined. So just staggering levels of economic inequality that we're talking about. Another way of looking at it, the wealthiest 1% have over half of the world's wealth. Have over 50% of the world's wealth, so more than the rest of humanity added together. And it's estimated that the richest 20% are responsible for about 86% of the world's consumption, whereas the same number of people in the poorest 20% are responsible for only about 1% of consumption. So the average person in the top 20% consumes about 86 times as much of the world's resources as someone in the bottom 20%. These are issues that weigh clearly very heavily on the mind of Pope Francis. Other popes have addressed strongly as well, especially from the 1960s on, and we'll talk more and see more details of that later. These realities are also applied to the United States, where the wealthiest 1% have more assets than the bottom 90% combined, where 1 in 5 children currently live in poverty, and it's estimated that currently about 1 in 4 children live in food insecure households. Again, a context where we clearly have the resources that everyone's basic needs could be met, but the political and other decisions have not been made to bring that about. And important to say, levels of overall wealth and income inequality in the United States are actually now near their peaks since slightly before the Great Depression, in terms of the growing levels of inequality. So with the Depression and then after World War II, you had significant decreases in inequality. And then from the early 80s on, you've had a sharp rise again in inequality. So that's one issue. Climate change is another that I'm sure you're aware Pope Francis has spoken extensively about, of course, wrote the Laudato Si encyclical, and has certainly put forth as one of the most critical issues that our world is facing. And so just some data there. The reality of climate change is very clear. We can measure it, right? We know the world is warming. So the first decade of this century was by far the warmest since modern records began, according to the World Meteorological Organization. But this was then surpassed by the most recent decade, which set a new record. 20 of the 21 hottest years ever recorded have all been since the year 2000, which, in other words, every year since the year 2000 has been one of the hottest years ever recorded. The 21st is 1996. So if you go back to 1996, you get all the hottest years. And the last 5 years have been the 5 hottest years ever recorded. You can see that as it gets charted. Again, temperatures are measured. This is looking at the last 140 years, clearly seeing a very sharp upward trend in temperatures through that time period. This is a chart of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And people sometimes say, there's been natural variations, right, of carbon dioxide. And there's an element of truth to that. And this goes back here about 800,000 years, the estimates of what the concentrations were. And there were some cycles, but they were all within a fairly narrowly defined range between about 200 and 300 parts per million. We are now, I just looked today, we are now up to 418 parts per million carbon dioxide. Many scientists have argued that 350 is the maximum safe level. So many scientists say we're well beyond the maximum safe level for carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere and need to not only stop putting more in, but also find ways to bring more out of the atmosphere to get back down to those levels. These are estimates of, without major changes, where we're likely to be by the end of this century. So a lower emission scenario from the UN puts it up at about 550, a higher emission scenario, and right now we're actually on track to heading at the rate to the higher emission scenario could be up as much as 900. So in other words, a world that humans have never, modern humans have never lived in, a climate that humans have never lived in, so unprecedented. Consequences, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. I could do obviously a whole presentation just in this, but there's some things people don't often think about when they think about global warming. So even running through them quickly, I think will be helpful. Melting of sea ice, sea level rise is certainly one that we're most familiar with, but changes also in rainfall patterns, droughts in many places, excessive rainfall and flooding in others. We're seeing that all around the world. Increased extreme weather events such as hurricanes and monsoons, seeing that as well. Increased forest fires, deforestation, again, plenty of evidence for that. All of these things contribute to harm to agriculture. Sub-Saharan Africa has been the most hard hit. It's estimated that within a few decades, agricultural production could decrease by as much as half in that region from the severe impacts of climate change. But it's certainly impacting other parts of the world negatively as well. Severe problems of water shortages. A lot of people depend upon melt from ice and things that accumulate in the mountains and then gradually melts. Less is accumulating because of the warmer temperatures, and it's also melting off faster, so more contributing to flooding rather than just a more gradual refilling of the water tables. Widespread species extinction, deep impacts on the well-being of the ocean and animal life, so destruction of coral reefs, acidification, increased spread of disease around the world, increased environmental refugees, and increased conflict, just some of the impacts of climate change. Scientists raise special concerns about what they call feedback loops. And these are kind of self-reinforcing mechanisms. So the main one is as temperatures get warmer, the permafrost in the Arctic begins to melt, and there's lots of methane stored under there, which is an enormously powerful greenhouse gas. That begins to melt, be released. It causes more warming, causes more melting, more release of methane. That's probably scientists' deepest fear, is a lot of that methane being released and a kind of runaway global warming coming about as a result of that. But there's other kinds of tipping points as well. But all of this is to say that scientists are expressing enormously deep concern about where our world is and the kinds of changes that are urgently needed. So this is from the UN Development Program. They say there's now overwhelming scientific evidence that the world is moving towards the point at which irreversible ecological catastrophe becomes unavoidable. There is a window of opportunity for avoiding the most damaging climate change impacts, but that window is closing. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, some of you might be familiar with this, they came to prominence, especially in the Cold War, for their doomsday clock that would highlight how close they thought we were to potential nuclear war. Now they have incorporated climate change into their model as well, and that's equal to them in concern to the danger of nuclear war. And they actually moved the clock the closest they've ever had it to midnight just 2 years ago. So their doomsday clock now stands at 100 seconds to midnight, the most dangerous situation humanity has ever faced. We now face a true emergency, an absolutely unacceptable state of world affairs that has eliminated any margin for error or further delay. And they just kept the clock at 100 seconds to midnight in their press conference a week or two ago, because they felt there's been inadequate response to climate change, as well as concern about the undermining of some of the nuclear treaties. So Pope Francis has, of course, said a lot on this issue. This is one of his quotes from a letter he wrote to an international climate change gathering. It says, "What you're going to debate affects the whole of humanity, in particular the poorest and future generations. More than that, it is a grave ethical and moral responsibility. The time to find global solutions is running out. Hence, there is a clear, definitive, and ineluctable ethical imperative to act." And perhaps even more strikingly, in an interview that he gave just before the final negotiations of the Paris Climate Accord, he had this to say: "I can say to you now or never. Every year the problems are getting worse. We are at the limits. If I may use a strong word, I would say that we are on the verge of suicide." And so clearly Francis has a deep understanding of the depth of the problem of climate change and the dangers to the future of humanity and the future of the other creatures on this planet as well. So that's a bit of our context. And it's always important to say Catholic social teaching documents have never really been issued in the abstract. There's always compelling issues that they're responding to. And so for Francis, economic inequality and climate change have certainly been at the heart of that. But it's helpful to take a little bit more historical overview and just talk about the origins of Catholic social teaching, what themes have been most emphasized throughout its history. Modern Catholic social teaching generally dated to this encyclical of Pope Leo XIII in 1891 called Rerum Novarum. Encyclicals, whatever the first few words of the encyclical are, tend to be its name. So this just means of a new things. Leo was responding to the realities of the Industrial Revolution, which by 1891 weren't that new, but the Catholic Church was a little late in addressing some of the issues there. But when it did, had some very strong things to say. So this is one quote from that document from Pope Leo. It says, "It has come to pass that working men have been given over, isolated and defenseless, to the callousness of employers and the greed of unrestrained competition. A small number of very rich men have been able to lay upon the masses of the poor a yoke little better than slavery itself." So some pretty, pretty strong critiques there of the exploitation of workers going on in the Industrial Revolution context of sweatshops and child labor and the like. And these are some of the things that were called for in that document: the need for a just wage. So we see still lots of struggles, of course, around that today in terms of the calls to raise the minimum wage and the calls for a living wage more broadly. Calls to end child labor, put limits on working hours to improve working conditions, health and safety, for example, and affirming the right of workers to form workers' associations or unions. And this theme of concern for the rights of workers has always been central to Catholic social teaching. It's been reaffirmed and reiterated in different contexts by all the subsequent popes. But other issues get added to the tradition over time. One of those is the issue of war and peace, so war and non-violence issues, and especially from the time of the 1960s on, this becomes a major concern in Catholic social teaching, beginning especially with Pope John the 23rd, who in his document Pacem in Terris, or Peace on Earth, in 1963, had this to say: "It is contrary to reason to hold that war is now a suitable way to restore rights which have been violated." The Second Vatican Council sort of picks up on that and talks about the need for Catholics to evaluate war with, quote, "an entirely new attitude," and by which they mean a much more critical attitude. And pretty much each subsequent pope has, expressed a deeper and deeper critique of war. Pope Paul: "The Church cannot accept violence because she knows that violence always provokes violence and irresistibly engenders new forms of oppression and enslavement. We must say and reaffirm that violence is not in accord with the gospel, that it is not Christian." John Paul, similar statements: "Peace never requires violence. War throws open the doors to the abyss of evil. This is why war should always be considered the defeat of reason and of humanity. War, never again." And I could give you many, many just strong quotes from John Paul critiquing war. And he doesn't make distinction between just and unjust war. He will use the language "all war" when he's developing these critiques. Pope Benedict, similarly strong critiques. And Pope Benedict has really come, the closest to saying, a just war is just out of the question in the context of modern war, right? So this was him responding to a reporter's question asking about Pope John Paul II's critique of the war in Iraq, which, as you hopefully know, John Paul was a very strong critic of. And this is what Benedict said in response: "There were not sufficient reasons to unleash a war against Iraq, to say nothing of the fact that given the new weapons that go beyond the combatant groups, today we should be asking ourselves if it is still licit to admit the very existence of a just war." So doesn't quite absolutely say that it's no longer possible, but comes extraordinarily close to saying that. And Francis has further developed that. So, quote from Francis: "War is never a satisfactory means of redressing injustice and achieving balanced solutions to political and social discord. All war is ultimately, as Pope Benedict XV stated in 1917, so in the context of World War I, a, quote, senseless slaughter. War is never a necessity, nor it is inevitable." And Francis has issued the longest document in the history of the papacy calling on Catholics to embrace nonviolence as a way of life in a holistic sense. He said in this, it was a World Day of Peace message a couple years ago. He says, "Jesus marked out the path of nonviolence. To be true followers of Jesus today includes embracing his teaching about nonviolence. Let us make active nonviolence our way of life." This is also included throughout, from the 1960s on, especially strong critiques of excessive levels of military spending. which are referred to by the Vatican as, quote, a crime, for even when they are not used, by their cost alone, armaments kill the poor. Something that Francis has added to these reflections on war and peace is the first outright condemnation of the possession of nuclear weapons, not only their use. So Francis says the threat of their use, as well as their very possession, is to be firmly condemned. So no longer does the Catholic Church accept, even in a conditional way, nuclear deterrence as something that's morally acceptable. But Francis has very clearly stated that it is not morally acceptable, and has called for global abolition of nuclear weapons. Other new themes get introduced into the tradition over time. So concerns for global poverty, especially with Paul VI, which he encapsulates in a phrase of integral development. So concern for the holistic well-being of persons. Ecological concern becomes an important theme in Catholic social teaching from the 1970s on. Some newer concerns. Pope Francis is the first pope to really explicitly affirm the inherent value of all creatures, rather than saying that the rest of the world is created just to be of service to humanity. Francis has very clearly articulated in Laudato Si that other creatures have inherent worth and inherent value that we need to respect. One can certainly argue that the implications of this haven't been fully explored yet in papal documents, particularly implications for our dietary choices, things like that. But it's opened up the conversation in a deeper way. So just a brief look, what are the major principles of Catholic social teaching? Concern for human dignity is obviously at the core of it. The affirmation, all persons are created in the image of God. This applies even to people who commit horrific crimes. So it's part of the rationale for the Pope's calling for the abolition of the death penalty, saying the death penalty violates the dignity of the human person that can't be lost even in committing an atrocious act. And this concern for human dignity gives rise to a broad conception of human rights, which we'll talk more about in a couple minutes. But also important to say, rights are always understood in Catholic teaching in a social context, in the context of community and the common good. So in Western political traditions, there's often kind of individualistic notions of rights. There's sort of rights to be left alone and not bothered, and or things like that. But Catholic social teaching, the rights are always have this broader social dimension. Sometimes they're called the minimum conditions necessary for life together in community. And it's a holistic notion of rights that includes not only the rights that have been prioritized in Western tradition, which are political, civil rights. So right to freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. But Catholic social teaching also affirms what are called economic or social rights. So the right to food, the right to water, the right to healthcare, the right to education, things like that, the right to shelter, along with corresponding obligations. So the sense that if people are, physically and mentally capable of working, and if employment is available, there's an obligation to meet one's needs through work. But when those conditions aren't met, or when employment is not available, that there is an obligation on the state to make sure the basic needs of all are nonetheless taken care of. So Catholic social teaching has a positive view of the role of the state in defending and promoting this broad set of rights. Connected with this, there's a strong affirmation of both political democracy, but also economic democracy. And I'm sure we've all heard the term political democracy. Economic democracy, at least for my students, is less commonly heard. But if you think about it for a second, you can get a sense maybe of what it means. So political democracy, what does that mean? It means not concentrating political power in the hands of a few, right? No longer does all the authority rest in a king. Economic democracy is not concentrating economic power in the hands of a few. So it calls for things like a more broad or equitable dispersion of wealth. So here, Catholic social teaching is often called for land redistribution, progressive taxation, other ways to distribute wealth more equitably. Doesn't mean exactly, entirely equally, but less unequally than is currently the case, certainly. It also includes the calls for increased worker and community participation in economic decision-making. So Catholic social teaching has always spoken very highly of worker-owned businesses. which would be kind of a pure form of economic democracy where the workers help make the decisions, also share in the profits, things like that. And so the world's leading example of successful cooperative was actually founded by a Spanish priest, the Mondragon cooperatives, some of you may be familiar with in Spain, who did it based on his understanding of Catholic social teaching. Economic democracy also includes strong regulations to protect workers, to protect the environment, to protect consumers. This is connected with a very deep theological affirmation that the goods of the earth are intended for all, that ultimately everything belongs to God. It's God's desire that the needs of all be met, and that this puts limits on, sort of absolute claims to private property, for example. And so this is deeply rooted in Scripture. You have in the Old Testament, Hebrew Scriptures, the notions of a Sabbath year and Jubilee year, which are, every 7 or 49 years, you were to have forgiveness of debts, redistribution of land, basically measures put into place to make sure no one becomes permanently marginalized and you don't have enormous divisions between rich and poor. And this was seen as what it meant to be the faithful people of God, is to make sure that those kinds of divisions don't arise within the community and within the broader society. And this is what the popes, appeal back to, is these central biblical themes. So John Paul II said it's the task of nations, their leaders, their economic powers, and all people of goodwill to seek every opportunity for a more equitable sharing of resources. And Pope Francis, the earth is essentially a shared inheritance whose fruits are meant to benefit everyone. For believers, this becomes a question of fidelity to the Creator, since God created the world for everyone. The Christian tradition has never recognized the right to private property as absolute or inviolable. John Paul II used the language of a social mortgage on property. He says, yes, it's useful for society to have private property, but if that's being used in ways that are harmful to the common good, the state has the right to intervene, to require more equitable distribution, or to put limits on what people can in fact do with their property if it's being used in ways that cause harm. So Francis really emphasizes inequality as the heart of a lot of the problems in our world. He says the need to resolve the structural causes of poverty cannot be delayed. As long as the problems of the poor are not radically resolved by rejecting the absolute autonomy of markets and financial speculation, and by attacking the structural causes of inequality, no solution will be found for the world's problems. Inequality is the root of social ills. So this concern for the common good, concern for equitable distribution of wealth, concern for a holistic conception of human rights has led Catholic social teaching to be very critical both of Soviet-style communism, but also of existing forms of capitalism. This is a quote from John Paul. Sometimes people are surprised by this because they're familiar with his critique of communism. They haven't necessarily heard as strongly his critique of capitalism, although he expressed them equally strongly. And so he says, the church since Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum has always distanced herself from capitalist ideology, holding it responsible for grave social injustices. I myself, after the historical failure of communism, did not hesitate to raise serious doubts on the validity of capitalism. And so the question is, well, then what's it calling for? If it doesn't like, Soviet-style communism, doesn't like existing forms of capitalism, and that's where that language of economic democracy is going to come back. It's calling for, it says, yes, there's an important role for markets, but there needs to be a more equitable distribution of wealth. There need to be stronger protections for workers, consumers, and the environment. More involvement of communities and workers in economic decision-making. What language we would use to describe this vision in terms of the traditional categories of left and right and things like that can sometimes be confusing. There's actually an interesting quote from Pope Benedict, where he's willing to use the language of democratic socialism, actually, saying that it's very similar to Catholic social teaching. So Benedict said, in many respects, democratic socialism was and is close to Catholic social doctrine. In any case, it contributed toward the formation of a social consciousness. And he's thinking here especially of the kinds of systems like in the Scandinavian countries and some of the Western European states where there is much more strong social support systems and things like that from the government, and more protections for workers and consumers and the like. So Pope Francis, just as the commandment, thou shalt not kill, sets a clear limit in order to safeguard the value of human life, today we also have to say thou shalt not to an economy of exclusion and inequality. Such an economy kills. This is a quote from one of Francis's early encyclicals. As this is that quote, we have created new idols. The worship of the ancient golden calf has returned in a new and ruthless guise, in the idolatry of money and the dictatorship of an impersonal economy lacking a truly human purpose. And then this last quote is from a talk to grassroots social movements from around the world. He says, let us not be afraid to say it. We want change, real change, structural change. This system is by now intolerable. So it's, again, really strong language, essentially calling for, as we'll see, a kind of a nonviolent revolution to bring about some very deep systemic changes in the economic and political systems of our world. These themes are deeply rooted, again, in scripture, including the notion of a preferential option for the poor, which we see from throughout the heart of scripture. The story of Exodus, God siding with the oppressed slaves, the prophets who are constantly critiquing when inequalities arise in their society and calling people back to this covenantal vision where the needs of all are met. Jesus, of course, placing himself deeply in that tradition as well. So Pope Francis, every individual Christian in every community is called to be an instrument of God for the liberation and promotion of the poor. Ecological concern is another theme that, as I mentioned, from the 1970s on becomes important in Catholic teaching. And we saw that already with some of Francis's quotes on climate change. But here's a quote from John Paul II. He said, today, the ecological crisis has assumed such proportions as to be the responsibility of everyone. Christians in particular realize that their responsibility within creation and their duty towards nature and the creator are an essential part of their faith. So this was 1990. He actually identifies climate change, or global warming, the language he used then, as being one of the most pressing issues that the world was facing. So 30 years ago, for 30 years, Catholic social teaching has been highlighting concern for climate change and saying that ecological concern isn't optional, right? It's, as he puts it here, an essential part of what it means to be a Catholic. And Francis, of course, in Laudato Si, talks about the need to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, and to see how harm to the earth and harm to the poor are often deeply interconnected. So we're nearing the end of this list of themes, but all of this, of course, gives rise to the call for major reforms of various kinds. So it includes calls for debt relief, calls for more just systems of international trade. So a lot of critiques of free trade agreements have been articulated by the popes, and a need for fairer systems of trade. Calls for decreased military spending and increased social spending, calls to decrease inequalities through things like land reform, preferential policies that preferentially support smaller over larger businesses, progressive taxation, things like that, stronger protections for workers, the environment. Also things like strengthening of the United Nations. There's a lot of emphasis in Catholic social teaching on the need for the United Nations to be strengthened to better deal with issues of war and peace and economic injustice and the like. And all of this placed within an even broader context of a consistent ethic of life. And so here's where concern about issues like abortion, euthanasia would also come into play in Catholic social teaching, and all of this being seen as what it means to defend the fundamental dignity of all people as created in the image of God, and all creatures as loved by God. So it extends beyond concern simply for humanity to include other creatures as well. Then the question is, well, how does Catholic social teaching think these changes can be brought about? And here you get a lot of language of solidarity. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, but solidarity is sort of compassion or empathy that has an element of action embedded in it. So it's not only sort of feeling bad about the problems of the world and economic inequality, destruction of nature, but also doing something about it, right? Being willing to take risks and to take action. That's what solidarity is ultimately all about. All of this in Catholic teaching is to be done non-violently. So there's a lot of emphasis on the power of nonviolence to bring about change, and enormous historical examples of the past few decades of repressive military dictatorships, other regimes being brought down through mass nonviolent action, including the end of communism in Eastern Europe that John Paul held up as an example of powerful nonviolence. And then even more fundamentally in some ways, that all of these kinds of principles are seen as flowing out of relationship with God, right? So how do you live the kind of life that Catholic social teaching calls you to, which is going to involve challenging injustices in society. It's going to involve taking risks. It's going to involve lifestyle changes. It comes out of this deep relationship with God. So the contemplative dimension of Catholic social teaching is sometimes, I think, overlooked, but is important to emphasize. Certainly, absolutely crucial in the writings of Pope Francis. To a contemplative appreciation for the wonders of life and deep relationship with God. So those are some of the central themes, and I don't know how we're doing. I'm probably over time. I'm always over time in my presentations, but let me look here. Yeah. We will quickly go through these last few things. I did want to just say a bit about Catholic social teaching and some of the other most pressing issues that we're facing right now. And one of those, of course, is racism in our society, but certainly around the world as well. So this is a quote from a statement that Pope Francis made after the killing of George Floyd. He said, "My friends, we cannot tolerate or turn a blind eye to racism and exclusion in any form, and yet claim to defend the sacredness of every life." And he's started to speak of racism as a virus in society that's at least as harmful as COVID. In other contexts, he condemns what he terms racist and xenophobic attitudes. Does anybody know who that is? Probably not, but that is a bishop. That is Bishop Mark Seitz of El Paso, Texas, participating in a solidarity vigil with the Black Lives Matter movement. And what's interesting here is two days after he engaged in this action, got a personal call from Pope Francis thanking him for taking part in this action, which is very unusual. Popes don't usually just randomly decide to give a call to a bishop somewhere. So Pope Francis was clearly trying to communicate something very strongly about his concern about racial injustice in the United States and his appreciation of church leaders who are willing to take a stand in solidarity. Pope Francis, of course, has spoken extensively about his concern for people who, by their circumstances of life, are compelled to migrate to try to survive and provide a better living for themselves and their families. Again, rooted in this notion, all people are created in the image of God, and so our concern for someone who isn't a citizen should be as great as our concern for someone who is. That those distinctions don't matter in the eyes of God. And so some of the things that Francis says richer nations especially are called to include, quote, to offer a generous welcome to those in urgent need. But equally important, to work to improve conditions in the lands that people are feeling a need to flee from by stopping exploiting these countries, right? And we could get into that whole conversation, but certainly if you look at why are so many people fleeing from Latin America, particularly Central America, it's deeply connected to the history, unfortunately, of U.S. foreign policy in Central America, to trade agreements that have undermined small farmers. I mean, a lot of different factors where U.S. policy has played an absolutely central role in creating the conditions that lead to people to flee. And so Francis says there's a moral obligation both to provide aid to those who are fleeing those circumstances, but also to address the deeper injustices that led to those conditions in the first place. And of course, many of you probably heard this quote from Francis when he was asked about, building walls, and particularly in the context they're talking about the border wall in the United States. When the reporter, I believe, asked him this question, he says, "A person who thinks only about building walls is not Christian. That is not the gospel," and talks about the need for building bridges, for welcoming migrants, etc. Francis has also spoken strongly against the rise of movements that have often built upon appeals to racism and appeals to kind of scapegoating of immigrants and the like, and really called that out. And so Fratelli Tutti, his most recent encyclical, has a lot along those lines in it, where he expresses concern that, yes, there are deep problems in society, but rather than addressing the true roots of those problems, which Francis would see as being based in unjust economic systems and the like, he says, politicians arise who try to shift the blame onto what he calls the non-neighbor, who try to scapegoat immigrants, who try to scapegoat the poor, who try to scapegoat, people of, ethnic, racial minorities. And so this is something that Francis has repeatedly called out and critiquing what he calls those false prophets who sell magic formulas of hatred and cruelty. And then lastly, a word about Francis's response to the coronavirus COVID-19 crisis. And Francis has repeatedly said he hopes this crisis will serve as a wake-up call to humanity. He wants to say, we can't just try to go back to what we consider normal before the crisis, because normal had lots of problems. And so he hopes that this will help us to experience, both the beauty and the tragedies, the injustices of the world more deeply, and try to live differently and bring about change in the aftermath. So I think that's a especially powerful quote here. He says, "Greedy for profit, we let ourselves get caught up in things and lured away by haste. We were not shaken awake by wars or injustice across the world, nor did we listen to the cry of the poor or of our ailing planet. We carried on regardless, thinking that we could stay healthy in a world that was sick." And so for Francis, the coronavirus is exposing in many ways the deeper systemic sicknesses of the world. And that's certainly, I'll come back to that in a second, the way that, racial injustice, for example, we can see deeply, impacting the coronavirus crisis. But Francis prays that the crisis will lead us to address these deeper structural problems and give rise to what he says are new forms of hospitality, fraternity, and solidarity, overcoming what he calls the globalization of indifference that he's constantly raised a concern about. He also expresses hope that the crisis will lead humanity to recognize the need to relate to nature differently. And we don't have time, but if we did, we could explore more of how it's exploitation of nature that has created the context where lethal viruses are becoming more frequent and more common, how we treat animals, how we treat animal habitat, et cetera, all of that deeply embedded in the rise of the COVID-19, but other similar kinds of problems as well. And he warns of the danger of what he terms the, quote, viral genocide if economic interests are placed above human lives. So critiquing kind of a too quick reopening of economies and things like that, when measures are needed to be kept in place to protect people's lives from the virus. So I said, we can certainly see racial injustice, for example, manifested in the coronavirus crisis. Just a few examples here. And I should say these figures are from a couple months ago when I had last updated a different PowerPoint that I had done on coronavirus, but I doubt that they've changed significantly over the last few months. But at that time, the majority of cases of the coronavirus were actually in the Latina, or often now people use the phrase Latinx to be a gender, a non-gendered way of referring to everyone in the Latina community. The majority of cases have been among Latinx people and people from the Black community, so highly disproportionate to the percentage of the population. So those two communities make up about 30% of the total population, but over 50% of the cases of the virus. It should also be noted that even though the numbers are smaller in sheer numbers, that some of the highest rates of the coronavirus in the country have been in Native American communities. And if you look at the death rate adjusted here for age, so in any given age group, what's been found is that the indigenous Native American population actually has had the highest death rate, a death rate of about 3.2 times as high as the white death rate, and that the Blacks and Latino or Latinx communities have had a death rate about 3 times as high as the white death rate. And again, we don't have time to get into all the details here, but lots of things that contribute to this. The fact that many folks from these communities are in lower paid service jobs, unable to work from home, that are more likely to lack paid sick leave and so have to go to work sick or have colleagues coming to work, coworkers coming to work sick, often have a higher rate of pre-existing health conditions due to higher rates of poverty and just the overall impacts of living in a society with a lot of discrimination built into it. Often less access to quality healthcare, more crowded living conditions, more likely to use public transportation, living in contexts with higher levels of pollution that makes serious consequences of COVID more likely if you live in a context where you already have had damage to your lungs and such from pollution. And so in short, multiple forms of systemic injustice can be seen, if we look deeply at the reality of the coronavirus crisis. And so these are just some of the reasons why Francis is going to say we need deep systemic fundamental change in our world. And I'm going to end here with just a couple quotes from Francis that highlight that and highlight the role that he sees kind of grassroots social movements as playing in response to that, which is an important contribution that Francis has made to Catholic social teaching. It's there in previous popes, but not in quite as strong of a way. That a lot of previous popes, their model of how social change came about was often more the church would educate the kind of economic and political elites who would then implement the right kinds of changes. And Francis wants to say, no, it's going to be more movements at the grassroots, developing and putting, pressure for change. So mass movements as a kind of a major driver of change. And so we'll see both the critique here of our current context and the call for these kinds of social movements. And so this is again from a talk that Francis gave to a worldwide gathering of grassroots social movements that was actually organized by the Vatican. There have been several such things. I think it's some of the most powerful documents in Catholic social teaching are the talks that Pope Francis has given to these groups. And so this is a quotes from a couple of those talks. He says, do we realize that something is wrong in a world where there are so many farm workers without land, so many families without a home, so many laborers without rights, so many persons whose dignity is not respected? Do we realize that something is wrong where so many senseless wars are being fought and acts of fratricidal violence are taking place on our very doorstep? Do we realize something is wrong when the soil, water, air, and living creatures of our world are under constant threat? These are not isolated issues. I wonder whether we can see that these destructive realities are part of a system which has become global. Do we realize that that system has imposed a mentality of profit at any price with no concern for social exclusion or the destruction of nature? If such is the case, I would insist, let us not be afraid to say it. We want change, real change, structural change. This system is by now intolerable. And then speaking to the social movements, he says, you, the lowly, the exploited, the poor and underprivileged can do and are doing a lot. I would even say that the future of humanity is in great measure in your own hands. The future of humanity does not lie solely in the hands of great leaders, the great powers, and the elites. It is fundamentally in the hands of peoples and in their ability to organize. You, the popular movements, are sowers of change, promoters of a process involving millions of actions, great and small, creatively intertwined like words in a poem. That is why I want to call you social poets. I congratulate you, I accompany you, and I ask you to continue to blaze trails and to keep fighting. And so I think a question for us to ponder is, what are ways that we can participate in these ongoing, social movements? What are some of those movements in our society today? What are ways that we can be involved as a church, as individuals, as a parish? I put together a few questions that I'll put in the chat for our breakout rooms. So let me go ahead and post that. And does everyone know how to see questions in your chat? If you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little thing that says chat. It'll probably also it'll pop up on your screen when I click this here too, but you'll be able to find it more long term in the chat. And so I guess the questions that I would ask you to think about and talk about in your small groups, and then we'll explore it together. Is there anything surprised you in this overview of Catholic social teaching? My students certainly are often surprised. They're like, I've been Catholic all my life and no one has ever told me such and such or such and such, that the popes have said this. So particularly the kind of deep critique of war, the deep critique of existing forms of capitalism, often not something that people say they generally hear. Are there things you feel most challenged by? Are there other issues you would like Catholic social teaching to address more deeply that you didn't see addressed in this overview? And obviously it wasn't a comprehensive overview, but certainly highlighting many of the concerns that have gotten the most attention in Catholic social teaching. And what kind of questions do you have in general about Catholic social teaching? So, were there things that were unclear or things that you would wonder about from this presentation, or just more generally? And so we'll take some time. How much time would you suggest for small groups, Jane?
Yeah, maybe 15 minutes, maybe 20. We'll see.
Okay. And do you want to do that, or do you want me to do that to do the breakout?
Yeah, I'm going to create 12 groups, so about 5 people in a group, and we'll send you a message when we're at about a minute before coming back into the large group. Okay. Thank you. Here we go. Are you here? Tony, Linda, and a person on a phone.
But what would you think of, I just got my copy of Fratelli Tutti. I haven't read it yet. But
Did Jillian Ogren give a presentation on Fratelli Tutti for the parish? I think a while back.
She did.
So that should be available, right? Or no, hers was the one that wasn't. Or was it recorded, or was?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, it was recorded, but her part. Okay, yeah.
And isn't there another session coming up on March 8th?
Do you have that date, Donna? Okay.
I do. I have March 8th, 7 to 8:30 for Telly 2D live stream.
Yes, good.
It's on my
Very good.
calendar.
Yeah, Alice, do you have that date?
give me the date again.
March 8th, Monday, March 8th, 7 to 8:30. And I couldn't find a way to sign up for it. It just said live stream.
Oh, okay. I'll take care of it.
I didn't. Yeah, if we're supposed to sign up, if you could
Okay.
let us know. I
Sure.
couldn't. It just said live stream. So
Okay.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I'd like
it's
that
really
too.
a powerful document. I have been reading it slowly. You have to kind of go slow. It's a slow read. It's dense, but it's powerful. It's really good.
Good. Thank you.
I'd like to give in our small group, Ida had an important comment, I think, about, we were talking about how comes Catholic social teaching is such a well-kept secret. And Ida was suggesting that what we really need to do is focus on training and educating young people about it and about lots of other things too. But I hope whoever said that our grandchildren are going to change things, hopefully they will learn about Catholic social teaching, and that will help motivate them too.
And I will say that's certainly true of my students, that when they hear kind of the fullness of this, their first question is, why didn't anyone ever tell me this?
Yeah.
Their second comment is often, if my parish had been teaching this, I would probably still be Catholic. So a lot of young people who've drifted away from the church because they haven't been challenged by the kinds of things that are being raised in Catholic social teaching. And they're saying, this is there in the tradition, the popes are saying these things. Why didn't anyone ever tell me? But I think that, you know, it's an important part of engaging with the younger generation is to be forthright and to be willing to challenge. Yeah, there's some controversial things in here. And, you know, if you go around talking about it, you may get called a communist, but, you know, that's central to what the tradition is teaching. And it's not just Pope Francis, right? We were talking about that a little in the small group. And that's part of why I'd like to incorporate all the quotes from Benedict and John Paul, is to say this isn't some innovation. You know, the critique of war, the critique of capitalism, the concern for ecology as central Catholic concerns, they're all there in John Paul and in Benedict, and most of those as well, and in Paul VI. So, you know, these are long-standing teachings of the tradition, but they are controversial, and so they often don't get taught in a parish context where people don't want to sound political or raise of ways. But I think following the example of the Pope is, you know, if you're quoting popes, it's hard to get, you know, be seen as too out of line in a Catholic context. So to know you're teaching well, and to be able to engage with people from different perspectives and show, you know, this was, you know, teachings of the popes that they may be more attuned to. You know, there's certainly some Catholics who, for various reasons, you know, think they don't like Francis because of things he's saying, but you can show them that, you know, the popes you like were saying the exact same things, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe that can help it be seen as something more central and rooted in the tradition as a whole, and not just be seen in political, you know, political terms.
Was there a time when a group of people sat down and said, we're going to write down Catholic social teachings, or did they just evolve over many years?
Yeah, I mean, it's largely evolved on this kind of ad hoc basis. The popes will see that there's some crisis that needs to be responded to, right? So for Francis, you know, Laudato Si was clearly, you know, trying to get the world's attention, especially around the issue of climate change, but also to see the deep interconnections between, you know, concern for ecology and concern for social justice issues more broadly. But as he puts it, they're two parts of the same crisis, and they need to be addressed together. Fratelli Tutti seems to be, you know, in many ways, a response to an increasingly, you know, divided, you know, public around the world, the kind of increase of polarization, the rise of, it's building upon, you know, hate and discrimination against people of color and immigrants and the poor, and a call to say, you know, we need to follow a very different path here, and be willing to, you know, to critique that and model, you know, a different kind of politics that is truly concerned about the common good. And yeah, so that's generally what it's been, right? So the first document was responding to the issues, as we talked about, arising out of the abuses of the Industrial Revolution. Right? Then the second main document was 40 years later in the context of the Great Depression. What were some of the, you know, lessons learned from that experience? And in the 60s, it was kind of raised growing awareness of global poverty.
And nuclear destruction. Parchment was
right, and nuclear, and you know, that's where war issues come to be more strongly addressed from that time on. In the 70s, you know, ecological themes become more. So it's always, you're responding. That's what I was trying to say at the beginning. It's not an abstract set of principles, even though it's sometimes presented that way, but it's always developing, deepening in relation to, you know, particular events, particular crises that the world is facing, and new things getting added. Like I mentioned, Francis articulating his concern for all creatures and the inherent worth and value of all creatures is relatively is relatively new within the tradition to say that quite so strongly. And so a lot to still be explored there of what are all the implications of really taking that seriously.
John, would you say it's accurate that Catholic social teaching does not start with Rerum Novarum, that Catholic social teaching started with Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago, and the documents that you've been thinking about tonight are expressions for our time and in response to specific current, but maybe part of the reason we Christians, we Catholics, don't appreciate Catholic social teaching is that we just don't respect and understand the teaching of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, certainly, Catholic social teaching ultimately rooted in the themes of the Bible, and I think you see that especially strongly, like in the U.S. bishops' pastorals from the 1980s. So the Challenge of Peace document around nuclear weapons and the economic justice for all, they have very well developed kind of scriptural sections that basis for those whole documents. Yeah, and I think that's that is the crucial response when people say, "Oh, this sounds like communism or something." You say, "No, it sounds biblical," right? And you can point to all the ways that it's flowing out of the core biblical principles, like this this notions of everything belonging to God and God wanting it to be shared, and the calls for redistribution that are embedded in the biblical text as being at the heart of what it means to be the faithful people of God, right? So this is it's more true to say that someone like Marx got it from the Jewish tradition in many ways than the other way around, that these themes are being drawn from Marx. It's more that Marx, of course, Jewish, and even though he rejected explicit religiosity, seemed to have imbued some of the language and concerns of the biblical prophets, and nonetheless. And so, yeah, always putting it back to say, this is ultimately rooted in the Bible, and especially in Jesus, and the way that Jesus drew upon to develop the tradition coming out of Hebrew scriptures. Is certainly crucial.
Can I make a request? Can you please post your presentation? It is
Sure.
so rich. It is so, I need time to digest it. I wanted to stand up and cheer at some of the stuff that's said. And I was so delighted to hear things that the conservative Pope said. I read something recently in Commonweal about Francis, and I just heard a conversation with William Barber, and they were totally in line. You know why they were in line? Because they were talking about biblical principles, and there's no daylight between them, and it was just beautiful. So I thank you so much for this, and if we could please have it, I would be so grateful.
Yeah, I'm happy to make that available. I also have a variety of handouts that I use, like in teaching my classes, that if I was doing this talk in person, I would have all kinds of handouts that I was giving you. I can share those with Jane as well. And she can
that would be great.
Sure. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Yes, we did record this, Mark. We recorded this session. You've been on recording here, and we'll turn that around, and Melissa will post it to our YouTube channel, hopefully by the end of the week, and I'll get that
would
word
be
out.
wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, you're
Thank you.
welcome. John, thank you so much. You've wrapped up our 6-part series beautifully with this topic. Thank you very much. I am going to prepare an evaluation that I'd like to send out to all of you in the next couple of days, and ask for your feedback about the whole series in general, and what you thought of that. So John had 2 hours of Zoom time before he even got on with us tonight. So go have some dinner.
I had a 2-hour department meeting right before this.
Oh my goodness.
We finished at like quarter of 7.
Oh gosh.
Had a long afternoon and evening. So, well, again, thanks, and peace to everyone.
Thank you all
Um,
for, thank you
all
all
right.
for being here.
Thank you
Thank you,
so
thank you for
much.
organizing
Thank
this.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thank
so much.
you.
Very
Jane.
much.
Thanks, John.
Welcome.
Good to
Thank
see
you
you.
very
If,
much.
if anyone wants to, chat either in person or on, either, via Zoom or email or whatever, has questions about any of this, feel free to be in contact. You can
Thank you.
connect with
Thank
me
you.
through the
Thank you
Xavier.
so much.
The contact information is
Thank you.
available on your website.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you
Thank you.
again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jane.
Thank you, John. This is great. Our people are, they're eager to respond. It's kind of overwhelming.